It was just past 3 a.m. when Eileen Hargrove stepped barefoot into the living room, clutching her flannel robe against the bite of the Montana winter air. The fire had long since died down to embers, casting faint glimmers across the log walls of the cabin. She'd come down for a glass of water, nothing more. But what she saw made her stop mid-step. There, sprawled across Rusty's hearth blanket, his prized, oversized patchwork quilt with the faded red corners, was a family of bobcats. Not one, not two, 4. A mother, her thick coat speckled with snowflakes, curled protectively around 3 kittens of wildly different sizes. One was tucked into her belly, eyes closed tight. Another lay draped across her shoulders, breathing slow and even. The third, smallest one, had its head thrown back in a tiny yawn, as if it had always belonged there. Eileen's breath caught. Her heart didn't race. It simply paused. In the stillness, she could hear their soft breaths, could see the steady rise and fall of the mother's chest. The only movement in the room was Rusty, standing in the hallway, ears forward, completely still, his gaze fixed on what was unmistakably his blanket. He didn't growl, didn't bark. He just looked at Eileen with wide amber eyes, then back at the wild animals occupying his bed. And then, in the softest motion, he stepped backward and sat beside her leg, leaning his weight into her like a silent question. The sight was so surreal, so achingly gentle, it felt like something out of a dream or a memory. And then Eileen whispered aloud, to no one in particular, "They came back." She didn't mean to say it, but as the words left her lips, something clicked inside her. The story wasn't beginning here. This moment, this breathtaking, impossible moment, was a return. 2 weeks earlier, this same cabin had held fear, chaos, the high-pitched cries of orphaned kittens, and one haunting stare from behind a bathroom sink. But now, this, a home reclaimed, not by its owners, but by a mother who had once felt hunted inside these walls, and now chose it again. Eileen didn't move, didn't dare break the spell. The snow outside had slowed to a whisper. The pines stood heavy, unmoving, their branches burdened with the weight of winter. Inside, time had folded in on itself. She felt Rusty shift beside her. He let out one of his long, slow sighs, the kind he saved for moments too big for barking. And Eileen thought, I need to tell you what happened. I need to go back to the beginning. Not for them, for us. Frank had always said the mountains would give them peace. After 4 decades of raising 3 children, weathering layoffs, medical bills, and one particularly reckless grandson who nearly set the garage on fire learning to weld, Eileen had stopped arguing. She agreed to the cabin. It was small, yes, but wrapped in stillness. No traffic hum, no porch lights from the neighbors, just the hush of pine needles and the occasional thump of Rusty's tail as he dreamed beside the wood stove. Rusty was a red-coated retriever mix, part duck dog, part philosopher. 6 years old and endlessly expressive. He had his rituals: 2 spins before settling, 1 dramatic sigh before giving up on begging, and a deep, soulful look he reserved only for Eileen, like he knew she carried stories she hadn't told yet. The hearth blanket had been a Christmas gift, hand-stitched by Eileen over weeks while Frank was away hunting elk. Rusty had claimed it instantly, dragging it in front of the fire, circling, flopping down with the sound of someone who had survived war. It was his territory, his throne. That morning, just under 2 weeks ago, it had started with a sound. Eileen was pruning dead stems off her window plants when she heard it. A faint, high-pitched cry. Not outside. Inside. Faint, yes, but unmistakably alive. "Frank," she'd called, already halfway to the hallway. "Do you hear that?" He grunted from the den, where he'd been solving yet another impossible Sudoku. Probably the water heater again. But she didn't think so. It wasn't a rattle. It was a cry. Not the mewl of a kitten, either. It was rougher, sharper. She stood beneath the attic hatch, waiting. There. Again, that same broken, wild sound. "It's coming from up there," she whispered. Frank climbed the ladder with the stiffness of a man who knew his knees better than he knew any sports team. He lifted the hatch and winced as cold dust rained down. The flashlight beam shook slightly in his hand. "Oh, Lord," he murmured. "What?" she called. "You're going to want to see this." She joined him on the step below, her hands gripping the frame as she peeked into the attic. 3 sets of eyes stared back. Tiny, round, unblinking, backed into a far corner between boxes of old tax records and the camping gear they hadn't touched in years. Spotted fur, oversized paws, twitching tails. "Bobcats," Frank said. Quiet, reverent, like the word carried weight. Eileen's stomach dropped. They were so small, barely bigger than squirrels. But there was no mistaking what they were. Not kittens, not strays, wild, lost, and terrified. They didn't move when the flashlight found them. One hissed softly. Another trembled and let out a chirp that almost sounded like it was calling. For their mother. "How did they get up here?" Eileen whispered. "Roof, maybe. Must have found a way in. Looking for warmth." They called every wildlife office they could find. The 4th one, Montana Wildlife Refuge Alliance, offered help. A volunteer named Savannah was on the way. But catching wild bobcat kittens? That was up to them. "What do they eat?" Frank muttered. Eileen already had the answer. "Venison. That smoked backstrap you froze from last season. We'll warm it. Use it to bait traps." "You're sacrificing my elk?" "For babies, Frank." He sighed, already halfway to the freezer. They fashioned makeshift traps from plastic storage bins and broomsticks. Each was baited with carefully sliced strips of thawed meat. The kind of plan that had no right to work. But it did. Hours passed. Rusty sat beneath the attic ladder, his head cocked in that thoughtful way of his. He sniffed the air once, then whined. At dusk, the silence broke with a clatter, then another, then a third. Eileen climbed the ladder, her heart in her throat. Each trap held a trembling, furious little body. The bold one hissed. The small one stayed perfectly still. The vocal one chirped constantly, as if narrating every moment. Rusty didn't bark. He just watched, head tilted, gaze flicking between the kittens and the venison scraps now gone. They were scared. But so, Eileen realized, was she. Not of the kittens, but of what came next. Because where there were babies, there was always a mother. And Eileen had no idea where she was. Savannah arrived just before nightfall. Mid-30s, calm eyes, truck full of cages and thick gloves, and a quiet authority that filled the space before she even spoke. Rusty met her at the porch with a low wag of approval. "3?" she asked as Frank led her inside. "All in one night," he said. They were curled up behind the camping stove like they were waiting on coffee. Eileen stood by the hearth, the blanket still rumpled from Rusty's earlier nap. The 3 kittens were now inside laundry baskets lined with towels, covered loosely to block out the light. "Let me see them," Savannah said softly. One by one, she lifted each towel. Her gloved hands were firm but gentle. The bold one squirmed immediately, baring tiny teeth. The small one didn't move, its eyes barely open. And the chatty one chirped so incessantly, Savannah chuckled. "Got a talker. That's usually a middle child thing," she murmured. Eileen folded her arms. "They're so different already." "Just like siblings," Savannah nodded. "We see it all the time. These guys are probably about 9 weeks, still fully dependent. Their mom's probably been out of her mind." Frank shifted. "Will she come looking for them?" Savannah hesitated. "If she hasn't already, she might soon. And if she does, she'll follow their scent. Maybe yours too." Eileen's spine straightened. A sudden awareness swept over her, as if unseen eyes were watching through the trees. "We'll take them to the center tonight," Savannah said. "But if the mother shows up, you need to call us immediately. Don't engage. Don't corner her. She'll be scared. And scared animals, especially mothers, don't act rationally." Eileen watched as Savannah bundled the kittens into individual travel crates. The bold one kept pushing its nose against the air holes. The smallest simply blinked, slow and silent. The chirpy one didn't stop its commentary until Savannah reached the door, and even then it let out one last mewl that hung in the air. Frank exhaled through his nose. "You think she'll really come back?" "I don't think," Savannah said, pausing at the edge of the porch. "I know." The truck doors shut with soft finality. The taillights faded down the snow-covered drive. And suddenly, the cabin felt much larger. Rusty paced that night. He didn't whine, he didn't bark. He just moved. From the hearth to the attic ladder. From the front door to the guest bathroom. Back again. Around 2 a.m., Eileen heard him settle on the blanket. She came downstairs to find him staring into the flames, ears alert, tail tapping once every few seconds. "You miss them?" she whispered, kneeling beside him. He turned his head slightly, resting it against her knee. "Just a few hours," she murmured. "They've only been gone a few hours." But the air was heavy, expectant. Eileen didn't know what made her check the back door. Maybe instinct. Maybe habit. Maybe the way Rusty's nose flared slightly at the wind. The latch was still set. The wind outside howled faintly through the trees. Snow dusted the porch. She closed it tighter, turned the lock, then stood there a while longer, one hand on the doorknob, the other pressed against the wood. Beyond the glass, the world was black. But something was out there, looking for something it had lost. The break-in wasn't loud. There was no crash, no splintering of wood, no barking, just a shift in the air. Frank had been half asleep in his recliner, glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose, when he heard Rusty growl, a low, uncertain rumble, deep in his chest. Not a warning, more like a question. Then came the sound, a soft thump, like something landing on linoleum. Then a second. Then the faint scrape of claws against tile. "Eileen," he called, voice thin, rising with urgency. "Something's in the house." She came from the bedroom barefoot, heart already thudding. Rusty was standing now, tail stiff, head turned toward the hallway. And then they heard it, a hiss, short, sharp, followed by a shuffle, the sound of a trash bin tipping over. Frank grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and moved slowly, careful not to startle whatever was waiting down the corridor. Rusty stayed by Eileen's side, unmoving but tense, ears pulled back. The guest bathroom door was ajar. The hall light flickered faintly against the edge of the mirror inside. Frank reached the door and nudged it open with the toe of his boot. There she was, wedged between the sink and the wall, her body taut with fury and fear. Eyes locked on him in that eternal, primal way that all wild mothers look when they believe everything they love has been taken. The mother bobcat. Larger than he expected, maybe 30 pounds, maybe more. Her coat was thick, slicked wet with melted snow. Her ears stood high, tufted tips twitching, and her breath came in rapid huffs. She had knocked over the wastebasket, shredded the curtain, and wedged herself as far into the shadows as her frame would allow. Frank didn't move. He simply backed away, breath shallow, hands still clenched around the flashlight. "Eileen," he whispered urgently, his voice cracking. "We've got a situation." They did what they could. Barricaded the bathroom with a hallway bench, an old trunk, and a chair wedged under the doorknob. Called 911, who redirected them to Animal Control. Animal Control redirected them to State Wildlife Services. Nobody could come for another hour. "We took her babies," Eileen said quietly, staring at the door. "Of course she came back." Rusty didn't leave the hallway. He sat down facing the bathroom, ears high, body still as stone. Every so often, his head tilted, listening. Eileen thought she heard a sound from behind the door. Not a growl, not a hiss. A soft, short trill, like a cry, choked and uncertain. By the time Wardens Blake and Terry arrived, the sun was rising faintly behind the ridge. Their truck headlights swept across the snow-dusted porch as they pulled up. 2 large carriers, thick gloves, tranquilizer kits. Calm steps, reassuring voices. "She's cornered," Blake said, after a few minutes of quiet observation. "That makes her scared. But she hasn't attacked. That's a good sign." Terry listened carefully at the door. "She's vocalizing. That's maternal behavior. She's not hunting, she's grieving." They moved gently, unstacked the barricade piece by piece. Hands steady, opened the door just a crack, spoke to her softly, like speaking to a child in pain. "You're okay, Mama. We're going to take you to your babies. They're safe. They're okay." It took over 90 minutes. One failed net. One moment when she bolted and nearly made it into the hallway, only to pause when she saw Rusty waiting there, unmoving, watching her with quiet eyes. Eileen swore the bobcat stared at him for a full 5 seconds. Not in threat, but in recognition, like she knew. Like she remembered the scent of that blanket, the heat of the hearth, the eyes of the animal who never growled. Eventually she entered the carrier. Not forced, just guided. A low trill escaped her throat as the door clicked shut. Eileen stood with one hand over her mouth. Tears warmed her cheeks in the cold morning light. "You found them," she whispered. Rusty leaned against her side, pressing close, then let out a long, deep sigh. Not tired. Relieved. They drove her through the valley before dawn. Frank and Eileen didn't ride along. They stayed behind, standing on their porch in the chilled quiet, watching the taillights disappear between the trees. The silence that followed felt strange, like the hush after a storm. Rusty didn't move from his spot by the door. He kept his head low, ears twitching, every so often sniffing the air, as if searching for something that had already gone. Later that morning, Savannah called. "We reunited them just after sunrise," she said, her voice thick with something between joy and exhaustion. "You should have seen it." Eileen closed her eyes, the phone pressed tight to her ear. "We opened the carrier, and she bolted straight to them. Didn't even pause. Went right into the blankets, started grooming them all. Licking, nudging, wrapping her body around them like she couldn't decide which one to hold first. She paused. Eileen could hear her breathing. And the kittens. They knew her instantly. The small one curled into her belly like he never left. The bold one started nursing like nothing ever happened. The little talker? He chirped the whole time like he was filling her in on every minute she'd missed. Eileen felt her throat tighten. The image was too much. Too close to something in her own memory. Of toddlers crawling back into her lap after a long day. Of moments when being a mother felt more animal than human. "They'll stay with us another night or two," Savannah continued. "Then we'll release them back into the forest, together. We want to give her time. She's been through a lot." Frank had come to stand beside her. He rested his hand lightly on her shoulder as she hung up. "They're safe," she said, looking out past the porch. "All of them." That night, the cabin returned to quiet. Eileen finally slept, Rusty curled beside her bed, his breathing deep and slow. But in the morning, everything changed again. Eileen woke to the smell of coffee and a pale gold light filtering through the curtains. She padded down the hallway, robe tied loosely around her waist, still half asleep. Frank was already in the kitchen, flipping through the paper. Then he heard her gasp. She stood frozen at the archway between the hall and the living room, one hand pressed flat against her chest. Rusty's blanket, the one with the frayed red corner and faded stitching, was no longer empty. They were back, all of them. The mother, curled into a perfect crescent shape. One kitten snuggled against her ribs, one sprawled across her neck. The smallest, nearly hidden, tucked beneath her paw. And Rusty, standing a few feet away, silent, watching. His tail wagged once, then again. He looked up at Eileen, head tilted in that soulful, questioning way. Not alarmed, not upset, just waiting. Eileen barely breathed. "Frank," she whispered. "Come here." Slowly. Frank rounded the corner and stopped cold. Then, to her utter disbelief, he started to laugh. A slow, low, chest-deep laugh that built until it echoed through the beams. "I'll be damned," he said. "They came back, and they brought the whole family." The Bobcats didn't stir. Not at first. The room was filled with warmth, the fire crackling low, the scent of pine, the soft rise and fall of sleeping wild things. Eileen moved to Rusty's side and placed a hand gently on his back. He leaned into her. His eyes stayed on the family now, nestled on his blanket. And then, without a sound, he sat down. It was an offering, not a surrender, just a quiet act of understanding. As if to say, "This is safe, I'll share." He let out a long, familiar sigh and laid his head on Eileen's foot, keeping watch. The Bobcat mother lifted her eyes, just briefly, met Eileen's gaze, and then, almost imperceptibly, she blinked. Once, slowly. The kind of blink that says, "I see you. I trust you. For now." Eileen didn't dare move. She simply blinked back. Maria arrived just after 10 a.m., her parka dusted with snow, camera in hand, disbelief written all over her face. "You're telling me," she said, eyes wide, "that she came back through your dog door and brought her kittens?" Eileen nodded, still a little dazed, standing barefoot in the kitchen with a mug of tea she'd forgotten to drink. No signs of fear. No scratching. Nothing. Just walked in, found the blanket, and laid down like it was her living room. Rusty gave a low chuff from his usual spot beside the hearth. He hadn't left his post since sunrise. The Bobcats were still there when Maria and 2 wildlife aides entered. The kittens were slowly waking, stretching tiny paws, blinking at the new voices. The mother didn't growl, didn't flee. She watched, alert but calm, her ears twitching at every sound. One of the aides whispered, "This isn't normal. They usually bolt at the first footstep." Maria crouched slowly, eyes level with the mother bobcat. "You remember," she said gently. "You remember this place? And you trust it." She looked up at Eileen. "I've never seen anything like this." They moved slowly, carefully. No tranquilizers, no nets. Just patience. One kitten at a time, scooped into warm-lined crates. The bold one batted the air with tiny claws. The small one went limp in Maria's hands, eyes half closed. The talkative one, true to form, chirped his way into the crate like he had opinions about every part of the process. The mother watched each one go. Her muscles twitched with every movement, but she stayed. When Maria finally approached with a thick canvas carrier, the bobcat did something none of them expected. She stood and walked, uncoaxed, into the open space, turned once, curled down, and exhaled one low, slow breath. "What just happened?" one aide asked, stunned. Eileen stepped forward, voice soft. "She felt safe here. That blanket, it smells like her babies. Like the fire. Like Rusty. Like me. I think she just knew." Maria nodded, mist forming in her eyes. "Wild animals don't do this. Not unless—" She trailed off. "Not unless they've decided it's worth the risk," Eileen finished. They secured the crates gently. No panic. No fear. Just an odd kind of reverence. Rusty followed them to the door, tail swinging low, ears perked. Maria paused at the threshold. "We're going to release them together, out near the ridgeline where the forest thickens. Somewhere she'll know. Somewhere quiet." Eileen looked down at the empty blanket. The faint indentation still visible where the kittens had curled. A single pale hair left behind. "I want them to remember this place," she said. Maria gave her a long look. "I think they already do." They left, and the cabin felt impossibly still. Frank returned from fixing the attic, patching the small hole the kittens had likely crawled through weeks earlier. He sat on the arm of the couch beside her. "You all right?" he asked. Eileen nodded, but her eyes were locked on the blanket. "I don't know if I've ever felt something like that before," she whispered. "Not just awe, not just fear. Something in between." Frank placed a hand over hers. "You were a mother once too, you know." "I still am." And then Rusty, as if on cue, curled beside the blanket. Not on it, just beside. Laid his head down, closed his eyes, and sighed. That night, the cabin glowed with quiet. No voices, no television, just the hush of pine trees bending in the wind and the low crackle of the hearth. Eileen moved slowly through the house, her fingers grazing the backs of chairs, the wooden edges of photo frames, the worn banister leading up the stairs. Everything felt different. The blanket remained where it was, still slightly rumpled, faintly warm from Rusty's last nap beside it. She didn't wash it. Couldn't bring herself to. Not yet. There was something sacred in the way it lay there now. Creased by paws, fur still caught in the stitching. As if it held not just scent, but memory. Frank was in the back room, tuning the old radio to a faint classical station. Rusty was asleep by the door again, facing out into the darkness, his body curled but alert, like a guard unwilling to abandon his post completely. Eileen sat in her rocker, a soft wool shawl draped around her shoulders. Her eyes lingered on the outline of the hearth. where wild met domestic. And no one fought for space. She thought of the mother bobcat, how she had tracked her young through a forest of snow and shadow, how she had entered a strange place, twice, despite every instinct urging her to stay hidden, and how she had laid her children down, not in the trees, not under the stars, but on a hand-stitched blanket beside a wood stove, in the home of people who had taken them from her, then brought her back to them. It wasn't forgiveness. It was trust, temporary, conditional, but real. Eileen reached beside her chair and picked up an old photo, black and white, faded at the edges. Her youngest son as a baby, curled in her lap. His hands clutched a toy bear, his mouth caught mid-laugh. She hadn't looked at the picture in years. There had been a time when her arms were always full, when the walls echoed with shouting and footsteps and slammed doors, when the house felt small because of how much life it held. Now it was quiet. Peaceful, yes, but sometimes too quiet. Until this week. Until a mother from the wild chose this place, not once, but twice, as sanctuary. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, persistent. It layered the porch in silence. Rusty stirred but didn't rise. Eileen watched a single flake catch on the window pane and melt slowly into a streak. She didn't cry, not really. But her eyes stayed glassy for a long while. In the morning, Savannah would call. She'd share how the release went, how the bobcats took their first tentative steps back into the forest, how the kittens followed their mother into the underbrush without hesitation. But tonight, there was only this: a quilted blanket, a dog who refused to leave his post, and a woman who understood something unspoken had just happened inside these walls. Something wild and rare and deeply, deeply human. She didn't need a video or a headline to prove it. She had felt it in her bones, in the stillness, in the breath they had all shared. Savannah's call came just after dawn. Eileen had been standing at the kitchen sink, watching steam rise from her coffee, when the phone rang. The sky outside was blushing pale orange, the trees still heavy with snow. "We let them go just before sunrise," Savannah said, "right at the tree line east of the ridge." "How did it go?" Eileen asked, though her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Perfect," came the reply, thick with emotion. She hesitated for a moment, just a breath. Then she led them into the brush. The bold one stayed close. The little one kept stopping to sniff everything. The vocal one? He was chirping the whole time, like he was giving a tour. Eileen laughed softly, a real deep laugh, then wiped at her eyes. "We fitted her with a tracker," Savannah added. "Just for a while, to make sure they adjust. They're already heading west, deeper into the preserve. I think she knows where she wants to be." "She knew the way home," Eileen said. "Yes," Savannah answered. "But for a moment, that home was yours." They ended the call without too many goodbyes. Some moments speak best in silence. Frank was outside brushing snow off the truck. Rusty lay beside the hearth, dozing, one paw twitching in a dream. The blanket remained. Eileen folded it that morning, gently, carefully, as if it were something breakable. She placed it in a cedar chest by the window seat. Not out of reach, but protected. They never did get around to replacing the bathroom curtain. The claw marks in the tile? They stayed, like signatures. Later that week, Frank hung a small wooden sign by the porch, carved with shaky hands and an old hunting knife. It read, "Sanctuary for all who wander with love." Rusty approved. He sniffed it, gave one slow wag, and laid back down beneath it. Weeks passed. The snow melted. Spring crept in, slow and golden. Birds returned to the trees, and the forest came alive again. Sometimes, in the early morning, Rusty would lift his head and sniff the breeze. Just once. His ears would perk. Then he'd sigh and go back to sleep. Eileen began leaving scraps by the tree line, just in case. One morning, she found a single paw print in the muddy path by the porch. It wasn't large. It wasn't fresh. But it was there. She crouched beside it, pressing her palm into the dirt just inches away, and smiled. Because some stories don't end with goodbyes. They end with a shared breath, a quiet return, and the kind of love that crosses the boundaries between wilderness and home. Rusty, from his spot on the porch, let out one final, dramatic sigh, and the mountains listened.